The German Sixth Army had been the tip of the spear, an unstoppable force carving its way deep into the Soviet Union. But as winter descended in 1942, they found themselves not in a conqueror's paradise, but in a rat-infested cage of rubble on the banks of the Volga. The decision to pull them back could have saved 250,000 men and stabilized the entire Eastern Front. Yet that order remained trapped in the throat of a dictator until it was no longer a strategic maneuver, but a death sentence. Before we step into the frozen hell of the Stalingrad pocket, please make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on, so you don't miss our upcoming series on the Pacific War. To understand why the retreat came too late, we have to understand the sheer magnitude of the gamble Adolf Hitler took in the summer of 1942. The operation was code-named Case Blue. If Operation Barbarossa, the previous year, had been a hammer blow aimed at the head of the Soviet Union in Moscow, Case Blue was a knife slash aimed at its jugular. The objective was oil. The German war machine was thirsty. The Panzers, the Luftwaffe, and the U-boats were burning fuel faster than the synthetic plants in Germany could produce it. The oil fields of the Caucasus, Maykop, Grozny, and Baku were the prize. If Germany took them, the Red Army would starve for fuel, and the Reich would have the resources to fight forever. Army Group South was split into two prongs. Army Group A would dive south into the mountains to seize the oil. Army Group B, led by General Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army, would drive east to the Volga River at a city named Stalingrad. Their job was ostensibly to protect the flank of the oil grab, to cut the river traffic, and to neutralize the city's industrial capacity. But as the summer wore on, the mission suffered from mission creep. The name of the city, Stalingrad, became a hypnotic lure for Hitler. It wasn't just a strategic point anymore. It was a symbolic prize. Taking the city that bore Stalin's name became an obsession that overrode all military logic. As Paulus pushed toward the river, the German advance stretched thinner and thinner to cover the hundreds of miles of open steppe on their flanks. The German High Command relied on their Axis allies, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies. These troops were brave, but they were woefully ill-equipped. They lacked heavy anti-tank guns, they lacked modern armor, and their morale was fragile. German commanders warned that the flanks were made of glass, but the High Command, intoxicated by the sight of the burning city on the horizon, ignored the warnings. They believed the Red Army was exhausted, that the Russians had no reserves left. By September 1942, the Sixth Army was sucked into the meat grinder of Stalingrad. This was not the mobile warfare the Germans had mastered. The Blitzkrieg died in the rubble of the grain elevator and the tractor factory. It became a Rattenkrieg, a war of rats. Battle lines were drawn not in miles, but in rooms and floorboards. A kitchen might be German, the living room Soviet. The Luftwaffe turned the city into a moonscape, but the rubble only created perfect defensive positions for the Soviet 62nd Army. Paulus was bleeding his army white, throwing battalion after battalion into fire to capture a few hundred yards of debris, while the Germans were fixated on the smoking ruins. Looking only forward, the Soviet High Command was looking at the map. Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky saw what Hitler refused to see, the glass flanks. They began secretly amassing over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and massive artillery reserves in the steppes north and south of the city. They moved only at night, camouflaging their tracks, enforcing absolute radio silence. It was a deception operation of massive scale. The Germans assumed the Russians were scraping the bottom of the barrel. In reality, they were assembling a sledgehammer. By mid-November, the trap was set. The Sixth Army was exhausted, low on ammunition, and completely fixated on the last few hundred yards of the Volga bank. They had effectively conquered 90% of the city, but that 90% had consumed their combat power. Meanwhile, Army Group A was hundreds of miles away, deep in the Caucasus Mountains, completely disconnected from the drama unfolding on the Volga. The entire southern wing of the German front was dangling on a thread. The logical military move would have been to retreat to a defensible winter line, shorten the front, and dig in. But the order was forward. The retreat that could have saved the initiative was simply not an option in the German lexicon of 1942. They were about to pay the price for their arrogance. On the morning of November 19th, the freezing mist on the steppe was tore apart by the roar of 3,000 Soviet guns. Operation Uranus had begun. The Romanian forces guarding the flanks were vaporized. T-34 tanks poured through the gaps like water through a burst dam. In the 6th Army headquarters, panic set in. Reports flooded in of Soviet tanks deep in their rear. The pincers were closing. This was a decisive moment. Paulus had a window, perhaps 48 hours, where he could have turned his army around and punched his way out before the ring solidified. A retreat now would mean giving up the city, but it would save the army. Every professional officer knew it was the only choice. They looked to Berlin for the order. Imagine being a commander, looking at a map that shows your enemy closing a steel ring around your entire army, and know that the only thing stopping you from escaping is a single word from a man 1,000 miles away. That was the reality for General Paulus in November 1942. The tragedy you are about to hear isn't just about a lost battle. It's about how the refusal to accept reality doomed the Third Reich. If you believe history is defined by these split-second decisions, hit the like button and let's enter the cauldron. By November 23rd, the Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalik. The trap was shut. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were encircled in the Kessel or cauldron of Stalingrad. The shock was absolute. The German army, used to be the encirclers, were now the encircled. Inside the pocket, the initial reaction wasn't despair, but an expectation of maneuver. The generals on the ground assumed the order to break out was imminent. They began making preparations to abandon the ruined city, turn their tanks west, and smash through the thin Soviet line before it hardened. General Paulus sent a desperate message to Hitler. He requested freedom of action. In military code, this was a polite way of begging for permission to retreat. He laid out clearly the 6th Army could not survive the winter in the open steppe without supplies. They had to break out and link up with the main German lines. His corps commanders were even more aggressive. General Seydlitz-Schurzbach argued they shouldn't even wait for Hitler's permission. They should just go. Better to be court-martialed and alive, the thinking went, than obedient and dead. But back in East Prussia, at the Wolf's Lair, the atmosphere was delusional. Hitler, looking at the map, refused to acknowledge the magnitude of the disaster. To him, retreating from the Volga was an admission of defeat he could not stomach politically. He was aided in this delusion by the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, in a display of criminal incompetence. Göring promised Hitler that his air force could supply the 6th Army by air. He claimed he could deliver 500 tons of fuel, food, and ammunition every single day. It was a lie. The Luftwaffe didn't have the transport planes. The weather was atrocious, and the Soviet anti-aircraft defenses were thick. But it was the lie Hitler wanted to hear. Based on Göring's fantasy, Hitler issued the fateful order. The 6th Army will stand fast. Fortress Stalingrad will be supplied by air. It was a death warrant. When the order reached Paulus, the window for a relatively easy breakout had already closed, but hard-fought breakout was still possible. The tanks still had some fuel. The men were still strong enough to walk. This was the second moment where a retreat could have changed the war. If Paulus had disobeyed, or if Hitler had relented, the 6th Army might have been saved as a fighting force. Instead, the air bridge began, and it was a disaster from day one. On the best days, the Luftwaffe delivered a fraction of the required tonnage. Planes were shot down by the dozen. Inside the pocket, rations were cut to starvation levels. The horses were eaten. Then the dogs. Men began to freeze to death in their foxholes. The medical situation collapsed. Without bandages or morphine, the wounded simply died. The fortress was becoming a mass grave. While the 6th Army was rotting in the pocket, a terrifying strategic reality was emerging for the rest of the German forces. Army Group A was still deep in the Caucasus, hundreds of miles to the south. With the 6th Army trapped and the Soviet forces surging west, there was a massive gap in the German lines. The Soviets were not just content with crushing Stalingrad. They launched Operation Little Saturn. Their goal was to drive south to the Sea of Azov and cut off Army Group A entirely. If they succeeded, it wouldn't just be 300,000 men lost in Stalingrad. It would be another 400,000 men lost in the Caucasus. a super Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most brilliant operational mind in the German army, was brought in to command the newly formed Army Group Don. His task was impossible: stabilize the front, rescue the Sixth Army, and prevent the annihilation of Army Group A. Manstein saw the chessboard clearly. He knew the Sixth Army could not be supplied by air. He prepared a relief operation, Operation Winterstorm, to punch a corridor through to Paulus. But Manstein also knew that his relief force, composed of exhausted panzer divisions, wasn't strong enough to drive all the way into the city and hold a corridor open. The Sixth Army would have to meet him halfway. They would have to execute Operation Thunderclap, the breakout. This meant abandoning Stalingrad, blowing up their heavy equipment, and fighting their way west to meet Manstein's tanks. It was the only way out. In mid-December, Manstein's panzers launched their attack. Against the odds, they ground their way through the Soviet lines. They got within 30 miles of the pocket. The crews of the lead tanks could see the flares fired by the surrounded soldiers in the distance. The rescue was right there. This was a final, absolute last chance for a retreat. Manstein pleaded with Hitler to authorize the breakout. He sent messengers into the pocket to tell Paulus, "Don't ask for permission. Just move. Break out now or you die." Paulus looked at his fuel gauges. He had enough fuel to move 15 miles. He needed to go 30. But more than the fuel, he was paralyzed by the chain of command. He was a staff officer, a man of rules. He would not disobey the Führer. Without the direct order to retreat, he refused to issue the code word thunderclap. The panzers on the horizon waited, their engines idling, watching the flashes of artillery in the distance, waiting for a breakout that never came. The fires of the rescue tanks faded on the horizon, leaving the soldiers of the Sixth Army alone in the freezing dark. They had been promised salvation, but the refusal to retreat when the door was cracked open sealed their fate. But the tragedy of Stalingrad was about to birth a second, equally dangerous crisis, one that threatened to collapse the entire Eastern Front. If you're finding this deep dive valuable, please subscribe to help us keep producing these historical documentaries. By Christmas 1942, the relief attempt had failed. Manstein was forced to withdraw his panzers to deal with massive Soviet attacks elsewhere. The Sixth Army was doomed. The realization rippled through the ranks like a virus. The fortress was no longer a military position. It was a holding pen for the dying. But in the cold calculus of war, the Sixth Army still had one final, grim function. As long as they held out, they tied down 7 Soviet armies. They were the magnet attracting the bulk of the Red Army's striking power. And this sacrifice was becoming essential because of the situation in the Caucasus. Army Group A was effectively dangling in the wind. They had driven deep into the mountains, planting the swastika on Mount Elbrus, but now the Soviet side was cutting across their rear supply lines toward Rostov. If the Soviets took Rostov, the gate would slam shut. Army Group A would be trapped against the Black Sea with nowhere to go. It would be a catastrophe twice the size of Stalingrad, potentially ending the war in 1943. For weeks, Hitler had refused to authorize the retreat of Army Group A. He still clung to the dream of the oil. He ordered them to hold their positions in the mountains, hundreds of miles from safety. It was the same stubbornness that trapped Paulus. But this time, the generals pushed back harder. Manstein and General Kleist argued that unless they began to withdraw immediately, Germany would lose the war that winter. The retreat from the Caucasus was a maneuver that had to happen now or never. Finally, in late December and early January, facing the undeniable reality of the map, Hitler cracked. He gave the authorization for Army Group A to withdraw. But it was a race against time. The German columns had to move hundreds of miles over icy mountain roads, harried by Soviet partisans and airstrikes, trying to reach the bottleneck at Rostov before the Soviet tanks shut the door. This retreat was a masterpiece of logistical desperation. They were marching through blizzards, blowing up bridges behind them, fighting a running rearguard action. And the only reason they had a chance, the only reason the door at Rostov was still barely open, was because the Sixth Army was still dying in Stalingrad. The ghost of the Sixth Army was buying time with their lives. Every day Paulus held out was a day Kleist's men could march closer to safety. In the pocket, the end was approaching. The Soviets offered honorable surrender terms in early January. Medical care, food, safety. Hitler forbade Paulus from accepting. Surrender is out of question. The order read, "The Sixth Army will hold their positions to the last man in the last round, and by their heroic endurance will make an unforgettable contribution towards the establishment of a defensive front and the salvation of the Western world." It was propaganda speak for, "You're already dead. Just die slowly so we can save the others." The suffering inside the city reached biblical proportions. There was no food. Men were gnawing on boiled leather belts. Cannibalism was whispered about. Typhus swept through the bunkers. The Luftwaffe flights had trickled to nothing. The Soviet final offensive, Operation Ring, sliced the pocket in two. The German discipline, ironclad for so long, began to fracture. Soldiers deserted, hiding in cellars, waiting for the end. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler coming to power, he promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was a cynical gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in history. Hitler was essentially handing Paulus a pistol and expecting him to commit suicide. He wanted a martyr, a Wagnerian hero to mythologize. But Paulus had no intention of playing that role. He was a broken man, disillusioned by the promises of air supply that never came and the relief force that turned back. On January 31st, Soviet soldiers entered the department store basement that served as his headquarters. They found the newly minted field marshal lying on a camp bed, unshaven, staring at the ceiling. He did not shoot himself. He surrendered. The surrender of the southern pocket was followed 2 days later by the northern pocket. The guns finally fell silent on the Volga. 91,000 German soldiers marched into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. But while the silence settled over the mass graves of Stalingrad, the ragged columns of Army Group A were crossing the Don River at Rostov. They had made it out. They had escaped the Super Stalingrad. The retreat from the Caucasus had succeeded, but it was a retreat that marked the end of German offensive power in the East. The surrender at Stalingrad wasn't just the loss of an army. It was a psychological turning point of the entire Second World War. The myth of German invincibility, already cracked at Moscow in 1941, was now shattered beyond repair. But why do historians say the specific refusal to retreat came too late to change the war? The answer lies in what happened next. Make sure you're subscribed for our final analysis. And let's look at the grim aftermath. The destruction of the Sixth Army created a massive void in the German lines, a whole hundreds of miles wide. Even though Army Group A had managed to squeeze out of the Caucasus trap, the German army in the East was forever changed. They had lost 250,000 of their most experienced troops, veteran soldiers who could not be replaced by conscripts. They had lost massive amounts of heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, and trucks, that German industry, now under Allied bombing, struggled to replenish. But the most damaging loss was a strategic initiative. Before Stalingrad, the Germans dictated where and when battles were fought. They held to serve in the tennis match of war. After Stalingrad, they were permanently on the defensive. The retreat from the Caucasus, while successful in saving manpower, meant giving up the very prize they had started the campaign for, the oil. Without that oil, the German war machine was on a ticking clock. They were fighting a mechanized war on a budget, rationing fuel, while their enemies grew stronger every day. The retreat that came too late refers to the broader realization that by late 1942, the German high command was paralyzed by Hitler's stand-fast mentality. Had the Germans retreated from the Volga in November 1942, immediately after the Soviet encirclement began, they could have preserved a powerful mobile reserve. They could have established a shorter, stronger defensive line on the Donetsk or the Meuse rivers. A retreat then would have been a tactical defeat, yes, but a strategic masterstroke that kept the Wehrmacht formidable. By waiting until January 1943 to authorize the withdrawals and accepting the loss of the Sixth Army, Hitler forced his commanders into a desperate improvisation. Manstein performed a miracle in early 1943, conducting a backhand blow at Kharkov that stabilized the front for a few months, but it was a temporary fix. The spine of the army had been broken on the Volga. The psychological impact on the German people was devastating. The regime tried to spin Stalingrad as a heroic sacrifice, a modern-day battle of Thermopylae. They played solemn music on the radio for 3 days. But the average German understood the truth. Fathers, brothers, and sons were gone. The letters stopped coming. For the first time, the specter of total defeat became real. The Fortress Europe mentality took over. The war was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. Furthermore, the disaster emboldened Germany's enemies. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was the validation of their suffering. It proved they could beat the Germans at their own game of encirclement and annihilation. It cemented Stalin's confidence in his generals. For the Western Allies, it was proof that the Red Army would not collapse, encouraging them to press ahead with plans for the invasion of Italy and eventually France. The tragedy of the decision lies in the waste. The German soldier Stalingrad was betrayed not by his lack of courage, but by a leadership that valued prestige over pragmatism. The retreat from the Caucasus was a correct military move, but because it was delayed until the Sixth Army was already doomed, it became a hollow victory. They saved one army by sacrificing another, leaving the Reich too weak to win, but still strong enough to prolong the agony for 2 more bloody years. In the end, the snows of Stalingrad covered more than just bodies. They covered the ambition of an empire. The refusal to retreat in time transformed a difficult operational situation into a catastrophe that decided the outcome of the war. The road to Berlin was long and bloody, but the signpost pointing to the end was planted in the rubble of Stalingrad, erected the moment the order was given to stand fast. Thank you for watching this series. If you want to understand more about the master of the retreat, Field Marshal von Manstein, and how he kept the war going, click the video on your screen now. Don't forget to like and subscribe